Good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock. It's time for us to begin this second part of a 2-week webinar as part of the Faith and Science Roundtable here at Pinnacle Presbyterian Church. That is a program of the Park Center for Faith and Life, the Fran Park Center for Faith and Life. I want to welcome everyone here tonight. We'll have a few more people joining in the next few minutes as well. Everyone here from Pinnacle Presbyterian Church in Scottsdale, and some folks participating tonight from outside the church. We began this series last Wednesday evening with a first part, COVID-19, the State of the Science, which was hosted by a longtime participant and coordinator of our Faith and Science Roundtable, Professor Kim Bussey, with a panel of others from our congregation and from the roundtable, talking about current knowledge and answering questions of our participants about the science of the pandemic. Tonight, we want to turn to our faith and ask a theological question about what it means to be a believer in this time, how to think theologically, how to think as people of faith about pandemic, about what's happening in the wider culture, about questions of justice and mercy, about the church during this time. We believe in those questions in the Park Center for Faith and Life. We're committed to finding places of meeting between Bible, theology, the world, and dialogue across differences of experience and differences in points of view. And our Faith and Science Roundtable is part of how we think about the world as believers. That started actually 7 years ago with a grant from the Templeton Foundation, and we have been meeting regularly ever since then. We love listening to experts and asking silly questions. We like learning together about the place where culture, science, and faith interact. I am so grateful tonight to have to be part of this panel and to have a special guest with us. Our guest tonight is Professor David Kelsey. Also part of our discussion tonight will be Dr. Mike Hegeman and myself from Pinnacle Presbyterian Church. Coordinating this tonight is Kelly McGinn. She's going to be looking at questions that you all can give. As part of a webinar, we don't see your faces if you're participating, but you are free to write in on our chat section or Q&A. You can write questions or make comments. Kelly will be looking for those, and she'll be pulling out themes and questions and bringing them to me, and then I'll be giving them to Mike and to David, and we'll attempt to complete our conversation tonight. First, let me tell you a little bit about we who will be speaking. David Kelsey is a cherished friend and an accomplished theologian and a dear person. He is also a Presbyterian clergyman, no less, professionally. He's the Luther Weigle Emeritus Professor of Theology at Yale Divinity School. He taught at Yale from 1965 until his retirement from the Divinity School in 2005. He's also been on the faculties of Dartmouth College and Emory University. He himself studied at Haverford College and Yale University. Among several books that he has written a couple of things I want to note. He's written on how theologians use scripture as they think theologically. He's written about theological education, which we are very interested in that from a congregational perspective here at the Park Center. He has written about the meaning of human persons in light of God, and he's written beautifully and eloquently on human suffering. He has a book coming out soon called Human Anguish and God's Power, which seems so relevant to our topic tonight in thinking about faith and the pandemic. So I thought of him, and he graciously agreed very quickly to be part of this conversation tonight. David's wife, Julie, is an Episcopal priest and an active leader in the church. Mike Hegeman, many of you know here at Pinnacle, is Pinnacle's assisting pastor in education and senior adult ministries. He's also the associate director of the Park Center for Faith and Life. He has both an MDiv and a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, He has taught in several places over the years, spent several years teaching at Princeton, and also directed a preaching institute there. He's a published and performed musician, and he also has taught at, of all places, at the Southwest Institute for Healing Arts, and spent many, many years here in Phoenix doing adult education as well. At Pinnacle, or at the Park Center, he's the principal instructor in our key theology series, which we call Project Faith. I'm Wes Avram. I'm the pastor and head of staff here at Pinnacle, and I'm the director of the Park Center for Faith and Life. I spent some time as a college chaplain and on the faculty at Bates College, and as the Clement Meal Assistant Professor of Communication at Yale Divinity School. I've been the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Wilmette, Illinois, and the Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church. And here at Pinnacle, I've been blessed to be here for about 11 years. I've taught at Hartford Seminary, Pittsburgh Seminary, and also Northwestern University. Over that teaching in those years, I've become very interested in how faith and culture interact and how faith influences culture. I have been honored and blessed to be Pinnacle's pastor and to serve with an able staff and this wonderful, committed congregation. Special thanks to Kelly McGinn, again, who is the administrator for the Park Center and adds so much value to the life of Pinnacle Presbyterian. And she says that she's going to be signing off a little bit later in order to read your questions as they come in, but we're grateful, Kelly, for all you've done to pull this together. Our order tonight is going to be this. I've invited David to speak for up to about 15 minutes or so. He can share his thinking as a theologian about this time we're living through and what he sees and senses. Mike Hegeman will respond to that and give some of his own reflections for about 8 minutes or so, and I will do the same. We will ask each other questions, and then I'll bring forward some questions and comments from you all. And that will be the course of our evening tonight. We'll go up to 90 minutes. We won't take all of that if we don't need to, but we won't take more than that, so we can keep our contract with you all. You might wonder, one, why is the question of faith in the pandemic a real question? Debate about the church, debate and questions about what God is about during this time, experiences of human suffering, healthcare and healing, questions of drama and end times, questions of what purpose God has in this for us, questions about justice and equity have all come forward to us and left Christians debating, reeling, wondering, and praying. And so we thought we might talk into that tonight. So let me invite Professor David Kelsey to be our first speaker. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Wes. It's an honor to be here. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic raises faith questions in at least 3 different kinds of context. So what I want to do to start this off is identify each of those 3 contexts and offer an example or 2 of the sort of thing I have in mind, in the hope that the rest of you will think of more examples as we generate among ourselves some theological reflection on the faith issues that each of these contexts raises. The first context, came up actually in last week's webinar on the state of the science. The webinar began with a wonderfully helpful presentation on the state of the science of COVID-19 that was clear and very accessible to us scientific lay people. And in the course of the discussion, it was pointed out that the questions that were coming in had shifted from being questions about science to questions about policy. And I gathered that policy had to do with society's policies about how to deal with the pandemic. I think that's a context in which Christian faith questions arise, because Christian faith includes a number of ideas about what the goal of policy that underlies legislation in our society ought to be. And I want to suggest 2 examples of of what I have in mind about that. The first is Christian faith's understanding of what it is to be a human being, ill or well, a human being. And key to that understanding is that we human beings are interdependent all the way down. That often gets lost in American culture, where we highly value the goal of being self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency, I would argue, is actually the polar opposite of a picture of human being that stresses human beings' interdependency with one another. To be fully self-sufficient would be to be fully inhuman, I think would be the stark way of putting that point. Now that's very important because various kinds of reactions to some policies that have been instituted to deal with the spread of the pandemic have been resisted on the grounds that it's infringement on our self-sufficiency. And that's where there's a cutting edge, I think, with regard to that kind of issue in Christian faith's view of what it is to be human. Or a second example, the pandemic is sometimes described as apocalyptic. That's a slippery word. But I think it's worth remembering that it's a biblical word, a New Testament term, among other things. And it's important to remember that in that context, the Greek basically means an unveiling, a disclosure. The pandemic has indeed been an unveiling, would be the faith issue here. It has been already an unveiling of deep inequities built deeply into the structure of our society. More people of color are dealt badly by this disease than others. People who are at the front edge of dealing with it are in positions that are insufficiently well paid and insufficiently well respected. These kinds of inequities come to view when something like this pandemic happens, when most of the time nobody even notices them, or so it seems. So the pandemic is an unveiling, and that unveiling, I want to suggest, just is Judgment Day. When the truth comes out, the judgment is obvious about what is the case. I'm building here on some lines in the Gospel of John, already in the conversation in John that Jesus has with Nicodemus. Jesus tells Nicodemus, "This is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than the light." You don't have to wait to the end times for Judgment Day. Well, those two points are only two of what I imagine is a quite long list of ways in which themes in Christian faith have a bearing on the goals that policy for our society, at which the policy ought to aim. Wholeness for human life and what the conditions are that make for wholeness in human life, and clarity about where deep inequities are located and need to be changed. So at the point where the science gives way to policy questions is a joint where Christian faith has some implications and some claims to make and some challenges maybe to our society. The second context in which it seems to me Christian faith raises faith issues in relation to the pandemic has to do with our common life together in the church. It's a question every denomination is now debating, worrying about, fearing the outcome of. And the question is this, in the context of a pandemic when we have to be socially distanced from one another, how can the church be a community gathered? Now, that's crucially important in this religious tradition because gathering is central to being a community of Christian faith. Christian faith isn't something that's just practiced kind of privately and interiorly and individually. It's a communal enterprise. And that's symbolized most powerfully, maybe, in the rites of baptism and the Lord's Supper, where the theme of our being all one body is basic. Now, if we can't actually get together and share in a way where we profit from one another's gifts, how do we be church becomes the question. With regard to that, I have a suggestion to make. I hope other people will have other ones. I think maybe it's helpful to remember church history here. There have been plenty of occasions in the past when Christian communities of faith could only gather in quite small groups. Generically, we could call them cell groups, I suppose. Think of the disciples gathered in after Jesus' crucifixion in rooms whose doors they locked. Roman Christians gathering in small groups in catacombs. Chinese converts to Christianity gathering in absolutely illegal small church congregations in people's homes. In Reformation England for a long time, depending on whether the monarch was Protestant or Catholic, people of the opposite persuasion were gathering secretly in small groups. There's a long history of church having to take that sort of form. To live for a long period of time as church with those forms will be a big challenge to our inherited and much beloved kinds of polity, the way we organize and govern our church. But maybe we could be inventive enough to find ways to adapt, change our polity to fit the situation. Small groups aren't necessarily a sign of weak church, would be the bottom line, I think. And the third context I want to lift up are faith questions that arise about how to talk about God in the midst of this pandemic. We both talk about God in the church, and to other people in the church's name, we talk about God. And we talk to other people also on God's behalf. But in the face of this kind of pandemic, how do we phrase it? What do we have to say about what God has to do with this? A lot of the time, the talk I hear talks about God as though God were an onlooker to the pandemic. So in talking about God, people say things like, God sent it, just a sweeping generalization. God did this. Or when they talk to people who are anguished about loved ones suffering with this disease, they talk about how God sent it to that person for a purpose, and since God is good, that purpose must be a good purpose. My reaction to that way of talking about God is that it always makes God sound like God is somehow outside of all of this and just watching it and maybe manipulating it, maybe intending it to do something. And I find myself wanting to say, what kind of a God would do that? What kind of a God would send it? What kind of a God, just in general? And what kind of a God would send it to my grandmother? I mean, what kind of a God is that? There's a woman named Kate Bowler was published a marvelous book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I Have Loved. She has a striking line in that. She's been on the receiving end of these kinds of remarks about God on account of a very severe cancer that so thus far is in remission still. But she comments with regard to many people who told her that God had sent that to her for some sort of reason. She refers to what she calls the trite cruelty and the logic of those who are perfectly certain about what God is doing. I wonder if Christian faith doesn't require a different way of talking about God in relation to this pandemic and other terrible things that happen in human history. Namely, to talk about a God who has incarnated God's self in the midst of human life, a God who, as God, became vulnerable to human life's deepest sufferings, a God who is with us in the suffering. In that kind of a setting, the question is not, why did God send it, or did God send it, or to what purpose? The question is, what's God's relation to what is going on in this pandemic? And the answer to that is probably best understood as God's there holding things together. There's a Greek word for that, pantakrator, holding everything together. Not manipulating it, but sustaining it and the people who are undergoing it and sharing it with them. That means that we aren't so much in the business of explaining everything that's happening to other people in God's name. We're not in the business of opining with great certainty. We're more in the business of listening and consoling. It seems to me that also has an implication for the way we worship, which is that we engage far more than we're accustomed to in the act of worship that's called lamentation. Lamentation, rather than what some people who study American religious history have labeled Jeremiah's accusations against the people that these pestilences have come because of their sin, blaming people for what's happening because they have misbehaved. That's talking about God, the onlooker, not God who becomes incarnate. I think with that, I'd like to stop and invite your reactions.
Thank you. 3 contexts. How we think about policy in light of who we are as human beings. The common life of the church and how we think about that in new ways, and how to talk about God and talk on behalf of God in this time. We'll invite Mike Hegeman to be our next reflector. Mike.
Thank you, David, for all of that. I was struck most of all with the sense of saying that phrase that small groups do not equal weak church. You know, and I think that was a key phrase in the midst of that, because I'm seeing that part of my ministry currently is to what we could call small groups online, and I am experiencing remarkable things, and I particularly work with senior adults most often, and at this time, and seeing people that at first we all thought, some folks, they're not going to be able to figure out how to use Zoom, nobody's going to be on, but we're now 21 weeks into 30 to 35 people showing up every week for one particular group, and really appreciating the fact that they can see each other, hear each other's voice, we're studying scripture, we're fellowshipping together. And that points in the direction of, in some ways, for me personally, as a minister in the church, I'm actually getting to know people better, I feel like, in this setting, because I'm not just shaking hands on the way people, as they're going out the door. I'm engaging more deeply with people. And this was a startling kind of outcome of all of this. I wasn't expecting that I would actually get to feel closer to people. But part of that's probably the fact that we are all needing that's whatever semblance of connection that we can create, in this time, and that pastoral care looks different. That we are really engaging with each other in some senses more deeply, more intimately, in this distance format. So that points me to a couple of thoughts that I had about looking forward to tonight. And I've been reading the Psalms quite a bit in these days, and hearing those voices in the Psalms, that you have this psalmist who speaks, he seems to speak in the singular. The psalmist always says things like, "Oh Lord, you are my hiding place. Oh Lord, rescue me. Oh Lord, deliver me." And so on one hand, we hear the psalmist who seems to speak in the singular, preserve my life, the totality of my life, my heart, my soul, my being, my life, preserve my life. And it's remarkable to think that the Psalms have become the songbook of the church. The sense of there's this individual sound, often an individual's voice saying, "God, be my God. God, oh, why have you abandoned me?" There's this interface between the individual and the divine and God. And yet the church picked up those very psalms and made them communal. Throughout the history of the church, we have cloistered people singing them throughout the day. These psalms in rhythms of the days, the weeks, the months, the years, of repeating these psalms as the communal voice of the church. And so I see this balance between the individual and the community as expressed in Scripture. And so I just remarking on Stephen the 1 verse that, "Oh God, you are my hiding place," and reflecting on that verse this week from Psalm 37 verse 2. And I think that's right. Got my numbers right. But just that word for hiding place shows the sense of a covering. God, be my covering, be my protector. But the word also has an air of secrecy about it as well. And I'm encouraged to think of Jesus, as you said, that the sense of going off to be, there's a prayer life that he has, a communion with God in secrecy, always seeking at certain points in his life, seeking these moments to be away from the crowd, from others, and to commune with God. And taking that as a certain aspect of the pattern we have with our individual or it's seemingly isolated, but not privatized faith. But then how the community is always coming back into Jesus' life as well. So I think that this for us is I can see this as a part of the rhythm that we are in, and however extended this pandemic is for us and this isolated way of being church, is that we have a rhythm, and that part of that rhythm could be lament, as you bring up, David, and N.T. Wright focuses on, the sense of what's the church's role right now? First of all, the church needs to lament and ask the question, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Hearing the me, both as an individual and taking that up as we speak the Psalms on as the church, as a community. And so that's where I've been really thinking about that. There's that sense of the secret place. And it's okay to be, at this time and place, that if our embodiment of the church is within our homes at the moment, that's a reflection of the whole church. I want to get back to something that I heard N.T. Wright say in his most recent, recent reflections on the pandemic. And I heard him say, and I'll explain this word for those who it doesn't have much meaning, but he says, the church is not platonic, and he says the church has to be actual, and he really calls for it, says for us truly to be church, we have to be together. So what he meant was, what I understood that word platonic there to mean is that there's some kind of spiritual reality beyond the physical, which is the true embodiment of church. I think he's questioning the fact of saying, he's a little nervous about saying the church is ultimately a spiritual reality, because he wants to really ground church in the practical and physical actions that the church does, both its gathering around the sacraments, as you mentioned, baptism and communion, but also its communal worship, but ultimately in its service. And I absolutely agree with all of that. And yet, as saying that it's really important not to say, God, why, but hopefully say, God, where are you sending me? Where are you sending us? How can I embody the love I've known in Jesus Christ in love of neighbor, and in whatever ways that is appropriate for me to do? And so, but I want to preserve a little bit too of that sense of what I say to the people as we gathered online. I said, there is no distance in God. And though we are physically distant, just seeing each other's faces and hearing each other's voices, we are in a sense of recognizing that we are connected on a deeper level. The Spirit binds us together. And so I actually find a lot of encouragement in that myself as I am exhorting others in that phrase, but saying there is no distance in God. And this is a great reminder, how technology can inspire our imagination towards that understanding, is that even though we're physically distant, being this close as a screen is, we can reflect on the fact is that God brings us, we are together in God, and that we do these communal acts like small groups in a virtual setting. For me, is an embodiment of some aspect of church. It's not the totality of church, but it's a bit of that. So lots of thoughts on that. But I was really, as I was looking through some other people's notes on this, I saw the word. Somebody was using the word, the church is global, all right? So it's a combination of global and local. The church is global. And I thought, it's a fun phrase to pick up just for the moment, to say, to point out to what I'm reflecting on is that, yes, the church is local, and there's a local embodiment of it. That means the physicality of being together and being church and doing the things of church. It also is global at the same time, in that it's, all the fancy terms we use in theology classes, the church invisible and the church visible. But I really do want to hold on to both of those. And I find that reflection reflected in the Psalms particularly, that say that the individual voice is taken up as a communal voice. And that the psalmist ultimately says, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. So some interiority, being private with God, and also that call to community at all times. And so I think I'll stop there. I'm sure I've got some other thoughts that I wanted to throw in there too, but that was the thrust of where I wanted to go with that. I appreciate, David, you bringing up the sense of the apocalyptic nature of our times is ultimately about the unveiling of the deep inequities in our society. And as many people are struggling, claiming truth over here, my prayer ultimately is that in this unveiling process, as God sheds light on all things that were hidden become revealed, that we will respond in compassion in both ways, towards both ends of whatever spectrum where people are finding themselves, and saying, there is room for us all into this sheltering, this hiding place, this place of that God is not only protecting us to keep us safe, but empowering us to be the church. So, all right, there's my sermon. I think I'll stop there for now and pass it off on to Wes.
Mike, thank you. It's remarkably rich, and I think I can just listen to the two of you. I find myself wondering sometimes. I think about the stages of grief, that it's said that one goes through in the process of dealing with loss and tragedy. And I think you could almost type theological questions according to different stages of grief people are going through right now, from anger to bargaining to resolution and we shape our theological questions according to those. But I guess as administering the church, I, like every pastor, David mentioned it earlier, I've been thinking every day about how to administer, fund, sustain, care for, shape, and in this context, open or reopen a ministry. I continue to resist the idea that Christianity and the church is closed right now. It is not. we are open, but we're open in different ways. So I've resisted using the concept of reopening. We're not thinking about reopening, we're re-engaging in different and physical ways. And we think about that, but I want to and time it, and we're wrestling with that medically and institutionally about when to do that and how. But I disagree with the idea that the most pressing question for the church, or the most pressing theological challenge to the church right now, is when to reopen, or how to live stream, or whether the government is impinging upon religious practices when it restricts gatherings, which our governor has said, and therefore refused to give guidance to churches. And yet other states, there have been restrictions. But I disagree with the idea that that is a restriction on religious freedom. We are free to do our work and do our ministry at this time, and to find ways of doing it, from small groups that are strong to online connections and to ways of serving the community. So I really think the most pressing question for the church right now is the same question that should always press on us. And that is how we are being called by God, not pushed by the culture, but called by God to be a cross-formed and cross-shaped people. And so I want to think a little theologically about the pandemic here. Some of my own thinking, and kind of inspired by what I've already heard tonight, but I want to talk about a couple of kind of ironies, I think, in the disease itself and in the pandemic, that kind of call a couple of theological questions for us. And one of those about the disease itself is its asymptomatic transmission. The fact that we've discovered and had to shape a whole way of life around this interesting fact that you can pass this disease without symptoms. That the time in which you're most contagious is probably a couple of days before you're even sick. And that some people pass the disease without ever getting sick. That's very interesting, I think, theologically, because it calls the question for us about our obligation to each other, the interdependence that David talked about. It calls that question to us because we are called to treat each other not to protect ourselves. Masking, for example. I mask not first to protect myself, but to protect someone else. Because I may pass a disease to them without even being sick, and unintentionally, without knowing it. And I think that's very interesting theologically. And also the widely varying symptomology. It's unpredictable, it's generational, different generations experience it differently, it's mysterious. We don't know how long it lasts. There are some things that are consistent and some things that are quite variable, which means we have to act out of trust and make judgments. So prudence, the kind of Christian virtue of prudence, becomes fundamental to us in this time because we have to make decisions without definitive evidence. So we have to listen, be diligent in our thinking, be trusting, and take action even before we know that what the definitive evidence is. And we also have to, in some sense, live as though we're trusting a negative. We can't prove the absence of something. I can't prove that my actions actually prevent something. I can only trust that they will. We can't prove that asking people to wear masks will definitively prevent a disease. We just have to trust it. And we see instances where it seems to have not, as evidence to buttress our decisions. But we've had to make decisions all along the way as a society without evidence on the basis of trust. And sometimes we failed in that. And so it calls the question forward, I think, about the nature of our commitment to each other, this interdependence, the nature of the church as an interdependent community, and the question of trust. And also about the pandemic too, as I said before, and David noted it, this widely disparate impact according to different communities, communities of color, communities who are doing essential work, people who live close together, the Navajo Nation here, the poverty of the Navajo Nation. I was speaking to someone today about one of the Hopi communities where they hear They hear that they're to wash their hands periodically during the day, and yet there's no running water in the village. So how do we think about those disparities in our society when, we had COVID in our house. My son had COVID, and we live in a large enough house where he could have his room. We could separate. We could wear masks in public spaces, and we could protect each other while he went through this experience. If we were not living in such a space, and what a privilege it was, the outcome could easily have been much, much different than it was. And so it unveils those differences and the national differences that we see, the extraordinary difference between what other countries are experiencing and what we're experiencing in some places here. Some places in our society were experience it much more like other parts of the world. But we hear word from a city that my son Andrew, that Pinnacle knows well about, was volunteering in Peru before he was evacuated because of the pandemic. And this is a city of 40 or 50,000 people. And we are told that 80% of the healthcare workers in that city, in Huánuco, are positive for COVID, which means the health system is effectively collapsed in that city. There are places in the United States where we were on the edge of that happening. There are places where it has happened. But the difference with other parts of the world calls the question for us of our interconnection to the whole world, not just to each other locally. So it calls forth the question of prudence and trust, and I think the question of charity and justice, that we have to learn how to act without seeing necessarily the results of our action because of this asymptomatic transition. And so it calls forth this kind of eschatological sensibility where we act for what we can't see. We continue to act for the future that God's promised us, for what we can't see, but we anticipate it even against the evidence. For me, I think my last reflection on this is I think about the kind of process that I think we as a church have gone through, and that I've gone through as a leader and the staff has gone through. It's not as simple as this, but there's some sense in which we've gone through a series of emphases. The first question we asked back in March was the question of continuity. How do we continue and preserve what we've been doing? And then we began to ask about communication. How do we continue to communicate and stay in touch with the congregation? And that gave way to a question of connection. How do we recreate forms of connection, small groups, and other forms of new things that we tried? And staff in the congregation and leadership was remarkable in experimentation, and that's still happening. But then that turned to questions of care. What's pastoral care? What's a funeral during this time? How do we stay connected to people who have needs and who are touched by the disease? Which led again to the question of continuation. When do we reconnect? When do we reconnect? When do we reconnect? And now I think we're beginning to ask more questions about the community, more questions about how do we help others. I even sense myself, but even in the congregation, people are asking less and less about us, and they're asking more and more about others. And there is more questions come to me, and more energy is coming every day around what's happening in these other communities, what's happening in the Navajo community, what's happening among the homeless, what's happening among the unemployed, and how can the church be helpful? The beautiful thing in that is that we are being the church in a new way in the world and looking less selfish to the world, looking less like a political interest group and more like a cross-shaped people, which is a kind of conversion. It's a new way of being the church, which is a pretty old way too. So that's what I've been thinking about and inspired by the two of you. And what I take as we get some questions coming in, let me give all three of us a chance to talk to each other a little more. And I'll be quiet right now for David and Mike to respond.
Mike?
I'm always a leader who's having telling, turn your microphone on. I get that chance. In thinking about this, there's one more phrase, looking at that sense of where is the church, and is the church a spiritual reality or a physical reality, or both at the same time? And I love the passage in 1 Corinthians that's where Paul reminds the church. He says, "Do you not know that you are the temple of the temple of God, and that the Holy Spirit dwells among you?" And I love the ambiguity. I'm going to be the Greek nerd for just a moment. The ambiguity in the text, it could be read, "Don't you know that you are the temple of God, and that the Holy Spirit dwells among you or within you?" And that it could be two of those things at the same time. And the yous are all plural in this sentence. But it's saying that the Holy Spirit dwells within you, but also in your midst at the same time. And so there's a sense of I'm trying to find a better words than the individuality of one's relationship with God, and the communal aspect of our being the temple of God together. But I want to hold on to both things. I encourage people sometimes to say, you are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and your neighbor is to go out and admire the temples that you see, the cathedrals that are walking around. But it points back to something David asked. And I want to see if you'd say a little bit more about that sense of being the more privatized we get, the more inhuman we become. The sense of our full self-sufficiency is ultimately inhuman, and our interdependency, not codependency, but interdependency, is a realization of our full humanity. How could you tell a little bit more about that, and where are there scriptures that point us in that direction?
Yeah, you've touched on what I find useful in the word interdependent, and that's the business that you were talking eloquently about earlier in your experience with these Zoom groups that you've been working with, where there's a rhythm of moving back and forth between being engaged with folks and being oneself. And that rhythm, it seems to me, is rooted in a pattern that I can only state in a sentence that would have a lot of hyphens between the words. It seems to me that in the richest kinds of relationships between persons, the relationship has this kind of dynamic to it, that each party yearns to be as close to the other as possible, but in such a way that the being close doesn't involve either losing yourself in the other or taking the other over as part of yourself. So to be close to somebody requires that each of you be yourself, which means not being the other person. And there's a kind of apparent paradox about that, but I don't think it's a contradiction. I just think it's the way the energy flows. And so to be fully human requires sharing life with other people in a more than just surface kind of way. But only insofar as that feeds my being, my growing, my becoming more deeply myself. And conversely, I can be close to others only to the extent that I encourage and empower them to become more fully themselves. I think I'm talking about the same thing you are.
I hear what you're saying. What Martin Buber highlights for us in his book I Thou, or that sense of the I and the thou relationship, which means I remain fully myself, but I only know myself more fully in relationship both to the holy or the divine God and to the other. In the sense of that you remain distinctly yourself, but only more fully yourself in relationship to me and with God. I always love that. I remember once that somebody referred to the word thou, and they said, oh, that King James Bible, it's so formal, that formal way of speaking to God. And I had to remind them, actually, I said, the word thou is actually the more intimate way.
Yeah.
At the time when the King James Bible was written, thou was more intimate, showed a more intimate relationship than you. So thou was, because you was there, they could have used it, but thou showed the informal, singular kind of relationship between two folks, I and thou, God, where God respects who we, I don't know if that's the right word or not. God knows who we are, every fiber, every hair of our being, all of this, and respects us, and yet in relationship with God calls us to more, to a fuller understanding of who we are and who God has called us to be in the world. So anyway, I've gone on too much with that I-thou relationship, is so, there's such an intimacy of that.
Yeah.
Mike,
Yeah.
And sorry, in the midst of the pandemic too, I think, how can I, when I'm afraid even to engage with my neighbor, the people that live right next door, I talk to them through through barred doors, or through our security doors, and say, how you doing? Over the fence, how are you doing? Okay? But that's about, I don't invite them in, and that feels awkward and feels strange, not to do the very things we're called to do, but continuing to say, how do I see and hear and listen to the other and see God in them?
I think that, yes, I think the I thou formulation in Buber is relevant here. I have the impression that in ancient Israel, there was a strong sense of the people of Israel being a body, so that when the psalmist says I, it's Israel speaking in one way, as well as King David or whoever wrote the psalm. And that's, the interdependency is a network. It's not simply binary, I guess, would be the thing I would want to add and stress there. And that's why physically gathering together in church to sing together, to pray together, to share bread and wine is kind of irreplaceable. And that's what we have to cope with.
I thought your discussion of the Buber and the I thou is interesting, in that for those who are participating in this, Martin Buber is a Jewish philosopher who created a philosophy and theology around relationship and forms of relating. And if I'm remembering right, he wrote once of walking in the woods with a cane or his walking stick, and at one point touching the base of a tree with his walking stick and stopping and staring at the stick and realizing that his connection to the other, in that case a tree, or for him creation, was both distant and connected at the same time. That the stick was a connection, was the betweenness, and yet it was also a separation.
Mm.
And without both, there was no relationship.
Mm.
Much like you were saying that we have to be individuals in order to be intimate. And I wonder if, I feel at times like we're worried that what we're experiencing is forever, instead of looking at what we're experiencing, saying, what do we learn from it now? So even in our separation, we learn something about our relationship. In some sense, we're measuring, like a walking stick, we're measuring our distance from each other right now in 6-foot increments. And yet perhaps that measurement is another way of reconnecting, so that we have new connections afterwards. We reconfigure. I don't know afterwards. I don't know if there is an afterwards. There's a transition into something else that includes the pandemic in it. But it's not like we return to what was before. We're going somewhere here.
But we are somewhere now, and we've got the double challenge of figuring out how to be church in what we've got at the moment, but in such a way that it is open to whatever will be the next now,
Yeah.
and we don't know what that's going to be.
No.
I was really interested also in Wes's comments about the theological significance of the asymptomatic character of this disease, because I think that's another case, another way in which the pandemic is an apocalypse, an unveiling. The so-called normal before COVID everyday life was a life in a world that was radically ambiguous. And you never knew for sure what was going to happen. And you trusted when you got in your car and headed off into the interstate that you'd still be in the car when you headed off the interstate. But none of these things are certainties. But most of the time we don't even register the tenuousness, the fragility of the fabric of life in our physical world. That makes it unpredictable in ways that we ignore until the accident happens. The asymptomatic carrier of COVID-19 is not all that different from other kinds of things. I mean, the tree that falls over in my neighbor's yard simply because it was rotted and not because of a high wind destroys my car just as much as if we have got a natural explanation for this. It was a tropical storm or whatever. The created world is a beautiful place, and it's good for its own sake. But I think in the eyes of faith, it's also got to be acknowledged to be a very ambiguous and fragile and place where creatures are all vulnerable to harm. And you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning excepting as an act of trust on the most ordinary of days. But we gloss that all over all the time. I guess we probably couldn't live if we didn't, but COVID's a kind of parable of what reality is in that regard.
What do you think is the kind of faith-based or theological difference then between saying, I build this fence to protect my car from your tree, or I build this fence to protect your car from my tree? Or wearing a mask. I wear this mask to protect you rather than to protect me. And I say that because mask wearing, unlike I think in Connecticut, where it perhaps has been a bit less controversial, it's very controversial in Arizona.
It has not been here, but I understand it has been in lots of places. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I guess my reaction to that is, well, I put on a mask because I understood it wouldn't protect me, but it would protect my neighbor, maybe. I've since learned that there's some reason to think it also protects me. Well, I didn't put it on to be morally more meritorious than anybody else. I just put it on because that's the thing to do. And if it turns out that it protects me too, that's fine with me.
Yeah.
I don't think that has a whole lot of theological, that distinction has a whole lot of problem about it. But to decline to take steps that one could take that you've been advised might help protect somebody else, on the grounds that one is a free agent and one will exercise one's freedom to suit oneself, seems to me not to square with our interdependence.
We have a question. One question that I've just been handed was for any one of us if we can share an experience or thoughts relative to, we touched on a little bit, to perhaps an increase in human compassion and sensitivity for the other as a result of COVID issues. I could give one from right here at Pinnacle. When we had almost spontaneously, not even really organized, a group in the congregation began to network early in the pandemic, even in April, they're still doing it to some degree now, to sew masks. They said, we can't go out, but we can sew. Turns out we have sewing machines, and this group made 1,000 masks, which were donated to a family shelter here in Phoenix. And I received word just today from the director there saying how they believe that that donation from this community of faith was the first step and pivotal in them preventing spread of COVID among 155 families. And it was spontaneous. It wasn't all that organized. It just happened. It was there's one experience that was asked for.
Something like that in the congregation that my wife serves, where people's individual first, and then they discovered one another in the congregation, they had sewing machines too, started making masks and basically giving them away, and taking them down to the local hospital and nursing homes where they figured they'd be needed most immediately. Yeah. I think also, this is dicey in some ways, but at least press around here have featured a lot of stories about what it has been like for nurses and doctors and hospital staff dealing with the flood of cases into the hospitals, and what both their descriptions of what having this disease is like as they talk about their patients, and what dealing with those patients does to them. In folks I have talked to, has had a huge impact in the listeners, the people around here who otherwise wouldn't know about it. Their sense of awe and anguish on behalf of the folks, both the ill ones and the care givers, for them in their particular line of work.
We just this week here at Pinnacle began a COVID survivors support group. And we had 8 people participate in the first week, and only 2 of them were associated with the church. Others heard about it through the grapevine and joined on. And we found there were a number of medical workers and that were there, and their stories are just remarkable. You know, the sense of all of these folks got it early on and had harrowing experiences with the virus, and yet are returning, even with trepidation, are returning to their medical positions. You know, they're saying, and telling, and then reflecting from some of their patients saying, they're saying, I'm just amazed that this person who has had COVID has come back to the medical position, work, and is continuing to serve. And there's so just remarkable stories of deep compassion for others in light of experiencing the virus, and the calling to that work. Not everyone. There were some people who talked about a real fear of actually when the time comes to return to the job, but they say they know that that's their calling, and they're continuing to do that. So these are things I've seen most recently, just encountering medical workers and their deep commitment to the welfare of others. Yeah. I meant to do we have another question yet? But I'm also intrigued the fact that we have in our midst here, 3 people who are reflecting theologically, who are in relative safety, and socially, economically, all these things, and wondering what people who are reflecting theologically, who are in much more vulnerable places. Just this last week, not even a week ago, Beirut blew up. Parts of Beirut, and it affected most specifically the Christian sector of Beirut was strongly affected. And so I'm not wondering just about, I don't have any news from any of my Mideast friends reflecting on that, but just thinking in general, have we heard anything from theological reflection from much more vulnerable positions? And if that would add to our conversation, what would that add to our conversation? And we have to imagine that at the moment. But have you heard anything from the margins?
I have not directly. I've read in the press articles that interviewed folks in disadvantaged neighborhoods especially when the pandemic was at its worst in New York City. Mm-hmm. And the New York newspapers covered localities in New York that were most severely hit, even in the context of New York's intense problem several months ago now. And but I haven't personally heard anything or read anything from that perspective on this question. So, I haven't heard anything or read anything from somebody interested in reflecting on it from the perspective of Christian faith.
I think it certainly has been interesting to see the coincidence, which may not be entirely a coincidence, but of the happenstance of the connection between the reckoning around race that's going on and the pandemic, and how that has been raised the question, this unveiling of injustice and these concerns that have come forward, and how even as we've had conversations here about the race question and had guests help us, that the connection has been made, that as though it just reveals a level of weariness, right? Mm-hmm. In those communities, in vulnerable communities. Exhaustion. I hear the word exhaustion over and over again.
I saw an image online about a month ago, but friends of mine at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, posted their music. I have a friend who's organist there, and he posted a picture of boxes of ashes, human ashes, that were individually boxed, of hundreds of Mexican nationals who had been working in New York City who had passed away. And so there were several hundred boxes of ashes that were going to be blessed at the cathedral. And then the Mexican consulate is going to ship them back to Mexico. And I was really struck by, this is something that I hadn't even thought about. The fact that, here's some vulnerable populations of foreign workers in our country without, this whole sense of dying, perhaps without community. I don't know all the circumstances of all these folks passing away, but it's in here one instance that the church cared enough not to create a ritual, but to actually to bless the memory of these folks and to say you're not alone, even and then to pass there, to bless these ashes or to send them off with love or whatever it is that they created to send these ashes back to their homeland. But it was a remarkable image of saying that there are probably many people that I'm not aware of who will pass seemingly unnoticed, and how is it the church not just, it responds to those as they've passed, before they've passed, in the midst of this defense. How are we responding to the most vulnerable is an important question for all of us. But I was deeply moved by that image and understanding of how, in one case, how the church reached out in the midst of the pandemic.
That is a powerful image. It, in a way, related to the last little piece of our conversation. It comes to mind that I think there's been a subtle shift in our use of the expression essential workers. Once upon a time, They were police and firemen. 9/11, the essential workers were people who rescued folks from the Twin Towers, called heroes, and they indeed were. Increasingly, it's come to be used to name folks who work in nursing homes and hospitals, who are very low paid. And I worry that the phrase essential worker used that way is becoming a kind of euphemism. We use the phrase in a way that's laudatory and congratulates them, and we thank them. But it doesn't lead to any change in the inequities of their pay or their working conditions. And so that's another way in which this pandemic strikes populations that are not among the comfortable. We who are comfortable, nonetheless, depend on them. And there's just something unjust about that equation. That goes back to the policy questions.
Yes.
And the way faith they can bear on them.
I heard one healthcare worker say at one point that among the people who are so angry now at a sense that their freedom has been restricted, wondering if they would be responding differently if they spent a week working in a COVID unit,
Yeah.
or doing some of this essential work that the rest of us depend on, feeling vulnerable all the while doing it. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, if I can, given our time now. One is not indirectly related to this, but I want to make sure we get time for both. But the first is, how can believers comfort and assuage the anger that seems so prevalent in this question among non-believers? I could say in the wider society. The anger that seems so prevalent, what is our response to that? Certainly see it politically. I see in the constant blaming. I received, even in a political season too, the blaming and the anger regarding these things.
Now there's all kinds of anger. There are people who are, at least as the anger is expressed, there are people who are angry at God, understandably angry at God. There are people who are angry at certain political parties or leaders. There are people who are angry in a kind of unfocused way. There are people who are angry because they think, they believe their rights are being impinged. I guess I'd want to sort out the occasions for anger a little bit. I don't think there's a way to address it globally.
Mm-mm.
And in any case, I think one listens. I think that's the main thing. One listens and tries to find out what in particular triggered it, or what they focus it on, as opposed listening and trying to understand them, as opposed to attempting to argue them out of it, or to assure them that they're entitled to be angry, but there are other more productive things to do. That's not what really faith calls us to do. They've got to make up their minds about their own lives, and even what they're going to be angry at or about.
Yeah.
And
we answer anger with love.
Paying attention, which is the root of love. Yes.
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 And also attending to our own anger, right? Yeah.
If that doesn't happen, then nothing happens. Yes.
Yes. The question I have here is about the end times question, and about how, so what response do we suggest when people say that this pandemic is of God and is of the end times? Those who have said that this seem to believe, therefore, that there's no point in doing anything about this. It's just meant to be.
In my first response, is to that sense of, is this the end times, is to see how many times in the past 2,000 years that the question has been raised, and not to escape into the history, to say, well, 1,000 years ago, they thought it was the end of times. In 700 years, 650 years ago, when the great pandemic, the bubonic plague hit Europe, and up to a third or a half of the population passed away, they surely had more cause to think of it as end times than we do now. I don't want to pass it off and saying, well, how many times have we thought this? And it wasn't the end. It was the end for some. But we've seen that this question has come up again and again and again. But that doesn't, it's not a helpful, I don't think that's always helpful for people saying, look, we thought it was the end 750 years ago. But I would listen and saying, understanding what's their greatest fears are at the present, and saying, I certainly know that at the beginning of the pandemic, or even before it, I had a sinking feeling. I just had a sinking feeling. And everybody around the office kept saying, Mike, what's wrong? What's wrong with you? And I says, I had the sense of, this is going to be bad. I had a real sinking feeling. And I realized that along the way that I didn't want to come from a year from now, or a year from that point, and saying a year of my life was wasted. I wanted to say, who is God? I mean, again, asking those big questions. Who is God calling me to be in this moment, that I can live fully each day? Because that's the sense of what David was saying earlier, is a sense of, we have this sense of trust. We get up in the morning, we get in our car, even though we don't have, in normal circumstances, there are many ways where this could be our last day. This could be our eschaton, our last, our fancy word for the end times. And so whether it is in this global sense of the book of Revelation and its schema for the end of days, or this is just another rhythm in the pattern of life we've seen again and again, is to say, how do I live fully each day? And that's what I would say to, my first answer to that is, how am I called to live fully this day, the life that to which God has called me? So I began journaling on scripture prompts, and to say, I want to, 5 years from now, I want to look back and say, how did I navigate this time? The sense of trust. And it really has helped me shift. There's certainly are days when I get up and thinking, I don't know how we're going to survive this. And I have to continually turn to faith and the faith of the community. And that's what I say, church, that's what the church means for me right at this moment, is saying that as I seek to lead, that I also lean into the embrace of God that I feel with from the church at this time, to say, we're in this together. So I know it's not that sense of, I always feel like I pass off on the apocalyptic question, but I say, listen for what the fears are, and saying, how is God throughout the book of Revelation is meant to be a book of hope. Those who endure to the end shall be delivered. And that's a sense of, what does it mean to endure? Not just to put up with, but I think to live fully, guided by God's Spirit in the midst of it.
Yeah, I agree. I take comfort in the fact that Jesus declared that he didn't know when the end day was going to be. And since he didn't, I don't suppose I'm obliged to know either. And that the faith stance on that, it seems to me, is that any day could be the next to last day. And that therefore one ought to live the day as the day that you're given, being for your neighbor as you best can in love for neighbor, and doing things that make for the well-being of your neighbor in that day. That doesn't mean that if the next day is the last day, it's going to ward that off. But it means that the fact that the next day is the last day is irrelevant to the way I live this day.
Isn't there a line that's been, it's been attributed to almost everybody? attributed to Martin Luther and to, I think, a couple of others over the years, but I don't know where it comes from. Maybe one of you do, but if you knew if I was told the world was going to end tomorrow, I would plant a tree today.
Yes.
Which whoever said it, well,
Good for you.
right?
Good for you.
I think I have another one here. Here we go. How does the church begin to incorporate what we're learning from this time? In other words, how do we intentionally reform as a cross-shaped people? It's a beautiful question.
Yeah, I look to the Lord's Supper, in the sense of how the church, not even the church yet, but how did the church respond to the death of Jesus, and how were people shaped, a new people shaped by this traumatic event, earth-shattering, world upturning, incomprehensible event. I don't want to too easily say is they created a ritual to make sense of the world, but in a sense they did. They returned to that penultimate moment, this Last Supper, and looked to shape who they were and their meaning as communal life around the symbol of a shared meal. And so there was a sense of allowing the story, allowing those events to shape them in their communal life. And so it's a good question. I don't have an answer yet, but I'm thinking, well, how and what ways, not that we're going to create new rituals around virtually washing hands or something, but to say, it's a really good question. So I'm going to continue to think about that. That's where I first turned to, saying the church has done this in the past. It has used events to shape their communal life. And I can't go any further than that to see where we're going to go around this, but it's called me to a deeper sense of calling, to continue to see the creative ways of being church. Other responses?
I'm going to let David respond. How do we incorporate what we're learning?
To the extent that what we in church are learning from living with this pandemic has to do with thinking about faith's implications for policy questions. It seems to me that I'm not sure reform is quite the appropriate word. That's the thing I'm struggling with. Deepening, anyway, intensifying of the church's consciousness, sensitivity to, like sandpapering your fingertips so you can crack the code on the safe. Sensitivity to inequity in society, to be more engaged in seeing how society is viewed by people not like ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, there are people who are stricken with this pandemic, but even if the pandemic isn't raging anymore, there's still going to be lots of ways in which the society's inequities are deeply felt by the folks victimized by them, and largely the others are oblivious. So the church, I guess, in our tradition, reformed and always reforming. The always reforming part seems to me what's upon us on that one. And this overlaps with the Black Lives Matter racial protests as well as the pandemic protests. Requires us to find ways to live together that are much more actively engaged in learning how the world looks to others, and especially others who are also of faith. And we don't we don't have a long tradition of doing that exactly.
I worry a little bit about rushing too quickly for answers to that question. Because I think sometimes we rush for answers as a form of closure. To
Yeah,
try.
we solved that one.
What's that?
We solved that one. Let's move on.
Solve that one. That's right. And there's simple things like, oh, we're going to be online a lot more, which is true. There's things we're learning during this time. But the question was about how to be a cross-shaped people. And I think we ought to take the time we need to learn that. We don't hesitate. We don't delay helping. We rush to help. We rush to solve injustice or to address injustices and needs. But we wait until the right answers come about the church. And I wonder if it might just mean framing the questions. Maybe I'm thinking about Pinnacle when I say this, maybe we identify 2 or 3 questions that this period has raised for us, and we name those questions. And like in a cathedral, maybe we make a banner out of them and we hang the banner. And so we don't forget the questions. And somewhere in the sanctuary, everywhere we look, everywhere we turn, the questions this period has raised for us stay in front of us. So we don't just quickly go back to the way it was, because there will be an instinct. My fear is that we're all just going to go back and just say, well, glad that was over. That's over. I'm glad we'll be glad part of it's over, but some of it we need to let change us.
I liked your point, Wes, about congregations being sometimes quick to respond without thinking too much about other ways we need to change. In my view, a big part of the problem with well-meaning churchly rushing to respond to injustice questions is that we don't take the time to find out how the people who are being impacted by these injustices think they ought to be addressed. We figure we know, and we're going to come and give it to them. And there is a kind of built-in paternalism about a lot of churchly social action that we haven't learned to overcome. If there's another arena for reform, it has to do with overcoming that dynamic. We know best. We have the experts. We haven't bothered to listen.
Thank you.
To what whoever they are, think about this and what they feel they need and what they perceive to be the dynamics of the problem.
I'd also note that given these differences in our society, we ask these questions, at least within the church, as a congregation that's strong. We're creative. I have people like Mike Hegeman and Kelly McGinn and others on staff here who are creative, energetic, and I speak with other pastors, even in our presbytery, who are deeply and genuinely worried about whether they'll even have a congregation when this is over, and are feeling far more vulnerable. We're feeling overwhelmed, but not vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
They're feeling vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this also it causes us to rethink our connection to the wider church as well as the society as a whole. Well, friends, it is 8:29. We have all of our questions, let me make sure, that have come in have been asked. Kelly has come back on. Kelly, do you have anything to add here?
I just want to thank everybody for joining tonight, and thanks to David. What an incredible presentation. We're all very grateful.
Yes. This last note too, that with apologies, I had promised that a recording of last week's webinar would be available several days ago. For a number of internal reasons, it is only this morning that we were able to post that. but a video of last week's webinar on the science of the pandemic is available on franparkcenter.org, which is the Fran Park Center website. And we anticipate that a video of tonight's webinar will be available sometime tomorrow. If you want to be sure, check in the day after tomorrow, or check in hourly tomorrow if you need to. But no, we will have that up and available on the Park Center website as well to stimulate further conversation. God bless you all, and thank you for tonight. And your generosity, David, has been a beautiful thing. We pray for you and for all of Connecticut and for all who are served at the Divinity School and in Julie's congregation, and through you for all the world.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Mike.
Good night.
Thank you, Wes.
Hey, everybody.